Hello, my name is Cole Stanley, and this is the oddity of psychoanalysis. The theory of psychoanalysis developed over the span of 2 lifetimes. The beginning of this theory revolves around Jean-Martin Charcot and his efforts to understand personality and reason inside the mind. He would pass these ideals and teachings to young Sigmund Freud, who would take psychoanalysis to its peak in the late 19th to 20th century Paris. Although Freud served as a figurehead for the theory, it is crucial to understand that he was taught through his schooling and his mentor. He didn't just happen to think this up. Time also played a massive role in the creation of this theory. This was a time of great advancement in many fields for the world as a whole, as man boldly stepped towards a more modern age. Yet in this time, the mind was yet to be studied and understood, thus giving birth to the psychoanalytical, like Freud, who were hell-bent on theorizing how the mind works and how people come to be the way they are in the long run. The definition of psychoanalytic theory is that it serves as the theory of personality organization, which has the intention to treat mental disorders by investigating a patient's mind. Although this purpose was provided, Freud would also experiment on normal people to hunt the mind's true function. The major beliefs of psychoanalysis are as follows. People lack the free will they believe they have, as in things happen for a reason or choices come from experience. Humans are born with sexual and aggressive desires, which seems apparent for most species on planet Earth. And finally, there is always a motive behind action. Even if subconscious, the mind tends to create a reason for anything and everything it does. Due to the individualization of this theory, Sigmund Freud seems to be the only major influencer of the psychoanalytic lens, at least at the time. He was born in the town of Freiburg in the Austrian Empire, which is now the modern-day Czech Republic. His family would move to Manchester, England, where Freud would grow up, and eventually, at age 17, he would head to the University of Vienna. Freud wanted to go into law, but eventually decided to head into a career of medicine. He would use Vienna General Hospital as the birthplace for a practice that specializes in nervous disorders. He contributed to the psychoanalytic theory by providing the basic ideals that follow, including a lack of free will. He set up a private practice in Vienna where by 1896 he would coin the term psychoanalysis, where he would attempt to link mental disorders to childhood trauma. He would also frequently diagnose himself and his colleagues. This lens tends to ask the following questions. What causes someone to do this? An example would be Santiago in The Alchemist, as he displays restraint through his entire childhood, then capitalizes on any chance to follow his dreams. Another question would be, what underlying issues does this protagonist have? One example would be Meursault in The Stranger, as he is conflicted about his relationship with death and whether one's life even matters. Another question is, are there any repressed fears or desires driving these characters? An example of this would be Santiago's fear of failing and proving his parents right, which drives him throughout his journey. Another example would be, what do most, if not all, characters in the story have in common? And an answer to this would be, most characters Santiago encounters in The Alchemist provide a dream or an idea they are chasing after. A piece of literature associated with the psychoanalytic lens would be Small World, an academic romance by David Lodge. In the story, David Lodge interprets romance in a more psychoanalytic sense, where it is described as a craving more than just feelings. Another piece of literature associated with this would be Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, where the author describes the importance of many characteristics that seem to be not so special after all. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley serves as a great example because it provides an imaginary world where Freud's ideals are implemented into reality. This lens helps interpret this book when understanding people's intentions and purposes that drive them throughout the story. Everyone in the story expresses their more animalistic needs and wants. These examples help reinforce what ideals are important when it comes to the psychoanalytic theory, yet some tend to be a little odd and dated. Psychoanalysis seems to branch from two major theories: archetypal criticism, where the aspect of character frames or types in literary works implies underlying issues and ideas, as shown in psychoanalysis. Aspects of both follow the same principle when it comes to the idea of the tragic hero. An example would be Sisyphus and his love of humanity. His individualized reasons influenced his choice to trick Hades into living longer. Feminist criticism also contains similarities towards psychoanalytic criticism from the psychological abuse towards women. An example would be Mary Cardonia, as she attempts to work towards ultimately being with Meursault in The Stranger, yet will never understand Meursault's actions that lead to their separation. Psychoanalytic criticism tends to be different from many other lenses due to its odd nature. A great example would be its differences from existential criticism. These two theories have conflicting opinions and ideals on many fronts. For example, existentialism argues that one creates their own worth, while psychoanalysis states that one's worth is already created through one's situation in life. Another example would be how existentialism argues that one always has a choice, yet psychoanalysis implies that due to past occurrences in subconscious thoughts or ideals, one has already made the choice before even being asked. An approach towards the metamorphosis would differ due to existential theory focusing on individual purpose and worth, while psychoanalytic theory would try to find individual drive and influences from choices. Another example would be the differences of a Marxist criticism. An approach to the metamorphosis through a Marxist lens would focus on the class struggle in a capitalist society and how a lack of humanity is apparent, which extremely differs from what a psychoanalytic critique would be. The first example from the metamorphosis would be its representation of id. Id focuses on the basic principles any animal would. Examples of id are reproduction, aggression, and survival. Id surrounds this story mostly on the premise of how Gregor's transformation showed the similarities to his old self and his newer form. The quote, "Was he an animal, that music could move him so? He felt as if the way to the unknown nourishment he longed for was coming to light," provides an accurate depiction of how all people have these subconscious desires that people do not even know they have. In the story, turning into an insect just brings these underlying needs to light. The images help represent the example of id in a more presentable manner, as survival represents Wilson and the WWE represents aggression, and Satan just represents reproduction and sin, I guess. The second example from the metamorphosis would be its representation of ego. Ego is the idea that children learn to cope and adapt to the real world given their individualized circumstances. When Kafka states the door could not be heard slamming, they had probably left it open, as is the custom in homes where a great misfortune has occurred. It is implied that childhood trauma has happened, and therefore shows that Gregor and his sister tend to react to problems differently. The sister throughout the story seems to pretend like nothing is wrong, which could possibly be a coping mechanism that she has learned earlier on in her life. After all, she is the last one to ultimately abandon Gregor, which shows compassion for the hardships they have faced. The third and final example from the metamorphosis of a psychoanalytic lens would be its representation of superego. Superego or morality is where one's conscience tends to drive the individual towards their ideals based upon values and cultures around them. Gregor's principles throughout the story tend to not change, providing him with an immense amount of guilt as a result. His conscience reminds him that he is not holding up the ideals set by himself and his parents. The quote, "He thought back on his family with deep emotions and love. His conviction that he would have to disappear was, if possible, even firmer than his sister's. He remained in this state of empty and peaceful reflection until the tower clock struck 3 in the morning. This shows how he feels empty after being unable to fulfill his goals as a result. His family suffers, burdens Gregor with an immense amount of guilt, to the point where his life is in the way of his family. Through the psychoanalytic lens, it is clear why Gregor decided to die in the end and shows the hidden motives throughout the story. Superego tends to represent morality, which is what these pictures shown are attempting to represent. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching. Man.